Welcome back to the deep dive. You know how this works. We had some really interesting material, and we are going to try to pull out, I guess, the really important points for you guys listening out there. So today, we're tackling Judah Halevi. Pretty important thinker, especially, I think, if you're, into philosophy and stuff.
Yeah. Big name. I mean, his ideas about how faith and reason kind of work together, those are still pretty relevant, even today.
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting, right, is the time and place. So medieval Spain, think about it. It's this melting pot, right?
Yeah,
You've
absolutely.
got all this religious, tension, right? It's heating up.
Mm.
And then at the same time, you got this rise of Aristotelian philosophy, like it's gaining ground, it's becoming a thing.
Yeah, yeah.
So Halevi's right in the middle of this. And the main thing he's dealing with is how do you defend a tradition, like a whole way of thinking, against all these new ideas that are coming up and challenging it?
And that's fascinating, right? Especially for someone who, studied philosophy. Because it's not just like arguing points of theology.
Yeah,
He's going up against a whole system, a whole way of thinking that's basically questioning how we even know things, right? Especially things about faith.
right, right. And here's the thing, right? Halevi wasn't like ignoring philosophy.
Yeah.
I mean, he studied it. He was a physician, right?
Yeah.
So he knew the value of observation, careful observation. He was into logic, like clear thinking,
Yeah.
math, like the whole, the whole deal.
That's true. That's true.
He actually saw the value in those things. He just had a problem with where they were going. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like when it comes to truth, philosophy can be pretty relentless.
Yeah.
It wants to question everything, replace beliefs, even stuff that's been around for centuries, traditions.
Yeah, that's philosophy, right?
Like if it can't be proven, it's out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was a problem for religion.
Definitely. So basically any idea that you couldn't prove philosophically, rigorously became, kind of suspect, right? And that put a lot of religious beliefs in a tough spot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's like, oh, if you're a philosopher, you're thinking you're smarter than everyone else.
Right, right.
You've got the truth, and everyone else is just, stuck in the dark ages or whatever.
Yeah.
So Halevi's problem, his main issue, was that philosophy was basically eroding the foundation of religious life. What people believed, how they lived, the whole thing.
So it's this awesome problem for a philosopher to tackle, right?
Oh, yeah.
How do you defend something like Judaism, which is based on faith and lived experience, when everyone's saying, well, where's the proof? Show me the logic.
Exactly.
And Halevi's response is so cool. He writes this book, the Kuzari, right? But it's not like some dry philosophical essay.
No, not at all.
It's this dialogue, this conversation, and it's all about this historical event, the Khazar kingdom converting to Judaism.
Yeah, centuries before Halevi, right? Yeah. And this wasn't just some small-time thing, right?
No. Huge deal. I mean, the Khazar king, he had options. He could have gone with, Christianity or Islam. These were big players, right?
Yeah.
So the fact that they picked Judaism, that had weight. It was like, proof in the real world, a real life example.
Yeah. And so Halevi's using the story to talk about, well, everything.
Yeah.
Faith, reason, the whole nine yards.
Yeah. Yeah. And the dialogue structure is really smart. For someone who's into philosophy, it's great because it's how philosophy works, right? You've got different perspectives, questions, debate. It's not just one person laying down the law.
Exactly.
It's a conversation. And he's using this past event to, address the problems of his own time. Pretty clever.
Really clever. And it's cool because he's not writing this just for, one type of reader, right?
Yeah.
It's on different levels.
Yeah. That's a great point.
So, on one level, it's for regular people, the Jewish community. It reinforces their beliefs and practices.
Keeps them solid, right?
Yeah. But then on another level, it's for the thinkers, the scholars, the philosophers even.
Yeah.
And it's giving them, intellectual guidance.
Yeah. Deeper stuff.
It's almost like he's speaking to different audiences at the same time, meeting them where they're at.
Exactly. And that's why, for us, we got to be those, what does he call them? Intelligent readers.
Yeah.
We got to analyze, what are the assumptions here? The metaphors? How are the arguments built? Are they reformulating ideas throughout the dialogue? It's an invitation to really think critically.
Exactly. It's not just about the story.
Right.
It's about the ideas behind the story.
Right. We got to dig deeper. What are the currents, the strategies he's using? It's all there.
So let's dig in, right?
Let's do it.
The story starts, the Khazar king, he keeps having this dream, right? And the dream's like, your intention is good, you want to please God, but your actions, they're not cutting it.
Yeah, it sets up this conflict, right? Between what you believe inside and how you act, how you live. So the king's freaking out. He wants answers.
Of course. Who wouldn't?
So he goes to a philosopher. He wants to figure out his beliefs, how to live, right?
Yeah.
How to actually please God.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So what does this philosopher say?
Well, this philosopher, he's, straight out of Neoplatonism and Aristotle.
Oh, yeah.
The whole, reason, hierarchy of reality, that whole system.
Okay.
And he's got a very specific view of God. God's not like us.
Right.
He's not happy or sad, doesn't know every little thing that happens, and he doesn't create in the way we usually think of it, like snapping his fingers and bam, there's the world.
Yeah.
This is because God is perfect, right?
Right.
And a perfect being can't change, can't want things, can't depend on anything.
Right. It's like a classic philosophical argument, right?
Yeah, classic. If God's perfect, creating something new would mean he changed, right?
Yeah.
He went from not having the world to having it. And that's a no-go for this perfect being. So instead of creation, we've got this idea of emanation. Things just flow from God eternally. It's not like he's making decisions,
So the world's always been here.
Yep. Always been here. And humans, too.
Wow.
Yeah. And when it comes to us, who we are, it's all about where we come from, our environment, our education. That's what shapes us. Free will, divine intervention. Not so much in this view.
Interesting. And so who's the ideal person in this system?
The philosopher, of course.
Right.
The one who gets to this this intellectual union with something called the active intellect.
The active intellect.
Yeah, it's like this 10th intelligence. It's incorporeal, not physical. And when you connect to it intellectually, it's like pure bliss. It guides you to do good, to be perfect.
So it's like the closest you can get to pleasing God, I guess.
Exactly. Exactly. And to get there, you got to purify your soul, get rid of all the doubts, You got to learn universal truths, be just. It's a whole journey,
A philosophical journey, right?
Oh, yeah. And the goal is to align yourself with this ultimate truth through the active intellect. It's not about a personal relationship with God, asking for favors. It's about recognizing God as the source of everything and then trying to be like that, to be true and good.
That's pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
And what about specific laws, like religious practices? What does the philosopher say about those?
He's not really into those, to be honest. He even suggests that the king could just make up his own laws or follow some philosophical code of nomos. Yeah. For him, it's all about the big ideas, the universals, actions. Not so important. He even talks about prophecy, maybe the active intellect can give you some glimpses of the future through dreams, but he doesn't think much of the king's dream. It's not from this high-level source. It's not philosophically sound.
Right. You mentioned Ibn Bajjah before. How does he fit into all this?
So Ibn Bajjah, he was big on this union with the active intellect, right? And he thought that people who understood true philosophy, they shared a mind, Yeah. And the ideal philosopher, kind of a loner, dedicated to thinking, to the life of the mind. So Halevi's using these ideas to represent, what philosophers were talking about at that time.
So the king's heard all this philosophy.
Yeah.
And he's like, okay, but how does any of this tell me how to live? How to actually please God?
Yeah, he's not satisfied.
He's still got this dream,
Yeah.
His actions are wrong. So he's looking for something practical.
Mm-hmm.
And philosophy doesn't seem to give him that.
Right. The philosopher builds this big, beautiful system, but it's all theory,
Yeah.
It doesn't tell you what to do. And the king, he's like, it's not just about good intentions, my actions have to be good too.
And he brings up this great point about Christians and Muslims.
Yeah. He says they both want to please God, but they do totally different things.
Right.
And he's like, well, they can't both be right, can they? It's this problem of different ways of practicing religion, even though they have the same goal.
Yeah. So he's basically saying philosophy, it's all relative, right?
Yeah.
If it doesn't matter what you do, then what's the point?
Exactly. But the philosopher, he kind of brushes it off. He says, well, at least we don't kill.
But that's not really an answer, is it?
No, not really. It's more about what you shouldn't do, not what you should do.
Yeah. And then the king's like, okay, look, I get your skepticism about creation in 6 days. But if you philosophers are so wise and virtuous, why don't you guys prophesy?
Oh, yeah. He's calling him out.
Yeah. He's like, where are the miracles? If you're so connected, show me the goods.
He's using his observations, the real world, to challenge the theory.
Exactly. And he's like, I have these dreams. I'm not a philosopher, but I get these messages right. and they mean something.
Yeah, yeah.
So he's starting to see a pattern.
He's putting it together.
And he concludes, look, there's got to be this divine order, right? Something's going on, and it's not just about logic and reason.
Yeah. He's the first one to use that term, the divine order. It's important.
And he's saying that people who have these prophetic experiences, there's something different about them, about their souls. Something the philosopher can't explain with his fancy logic.
Right. It's like he's sensing something beyond the purely rational, something philosophy misses.
Exactly. So the philosopher's out, the king's like, next. And he goes to Christian and Muslim scholars. But why not Jewish ones first?
Well, at that time, the Jewish people were scattered. They didn't have a big kingdom or anything. They were kind of, oppressed in a lot of places. So the king's thinking, well, they're not exactly a shining example of divine favor, right?
Well, that's a very practical consideration.
Yeah. But he asks the Christian and Muslim scholars the same question. What do you know and what do you do?
So he's interested in their theology and their practice.
Yeah, the whole package. And both of them, they claim to be the true heirs of the biblical tradition. They're both saying, we're the continuation of that story, that revelation.
Interesting. But the king doesn't buy it, right?
No. He's like, Christianity, some of your stuff just doesn't make sense. It's not logical.
Right.
And then Islam, he's like, look, I need more proof. You're saying this revelation happened, but where's the evidence? He wants something solid.
He's got standards, right?
He does. And they're good standards, even from a philosophical point of view.
Yeah.
He wants something miraculous, something that can't be explained naturally, and it has to be witnessed by a lot of people, something they saw with their own eyes. And he wants something you can study, examine, something concrete.
So he's looking for real evidence.
Yeah.
And that's why he finally goes to a Jewish sage.
Right. He's like, well, these other guys are all pointing back to ancient Israel, to that prophetic tradition. I got to talk to someone from the source, right?
Yeah. Makes sense.
So he brings in the Jewish sage, and the sage's response is super interesting. It's not all philosophical and abstract, you know? He just comes out and says, look, we believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. The God who saved us from Egypt, who took care of us, who gave us the promised land, who sent Moses and the prophets. That's our God.
It's a very historical, grounded statement.
He's starting with experience, with real events.
And that's important, right? The king asked about belief, but the sage talks about faith.
Yeah. And that's different,
It
The
is.
belief is, like, you accept an idea, but faith, that's deeper. It's about trust, reliance. It's based on what you've lived through, what your people have experienced,
Yeah. And it's cool because he's saying that faith isn't just about what one person thinks, right? It's about this shared history, this collective memory. And it's backed up by events, things people saw, miracles even.
Exactly. It's a different way of knowing than the philosophers,
Oh, yeah.
It's not just logic and reason. It's about what's happened, what we remember.
But the king, he's kind of confused. He expected the sage to talk about God as the creator, the one who runs everything, like a philosophical argument.
Yeah.
But the sage doesn't do that.
And he explains why. He's like, those philosophical ideas, they're full of holes. And philosophers, they can't even agree with each other.
Which is funny, right?
It is. He's basically saying, you guys are always arguing. Where's the certainty you're always talking about?
Yeah.
And he even uses philosophical terms,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he talks about different types of arguments, like demonstrative, dialectical, and he's using them to show that philosophy isn't as certain as it claims to be.
That's so cool.
Yeah. And then he contrasts that with, like, direct observation. Historical events that everyone saw. He's like, those don't need proof, They just are.
But the king's still stuck on the proof thing,
Yeah,
right?
he's like, wait, you're saying your historical stories, that's the proof.
So the sage has to bridge this gap. He's got to show the king how a historical narrative can actually be proof,
Right. And he does this with a thought experiment.
Thought experiment, okay.
Yeah. He says, imagine there's this really virtuous king in India, and his people are just and righteous. Okay.
Oh,
So the Khazar king's like, sure, but why should I care?
right, exactly.
There's no connection. The king's like, maybe they're just good people, or maybe they learned it from someone else. What's it to me?
Yeah, it's just information, right?
Yeah. Then the sage changes it up. He says, now imagine a messenger from this Indian king comes to you with gifts. He's got a message with the king's seal, medicine, and even poison.
Okay.
And now the Khazar king's like, oh, okay, now I have to pay attention.
Yeah, now it's real, right?
Yeah, because now there's a relationship, a connection, the gifts, the message. It's like the Indian king is reaching out, showing his power.
Yeah.
And you can't ignore that.
Yeah. So the sage asks, how would you describe this Indian king now? And the Khazar king's like, well, I'd start with what I see, right? The gifts, the messenger, the message. And then I think about what other kings are like, what makes them powerful. So he's building his understanding on experience, on evidence.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really cool. The sage is saying that the first scenario, that's like philosophical religion. You hear about this distant God, this creator, but it's not personal, right? It doesn't touch your life.
Right, it's just a concept.
Yeah. But the second scenario, that's revealed religion. God's reaching out, acting in history. It's like the Exodus, you know? It creates a relationship, a connection. You feel obligated because you've been touched by this power.
Yeah, it's like the difference between knowing about a king and actually being in his court, right?
Exactly, exactly. So the sage is saying that Jewish belief isn't just about philosophy. It's about this experience, this relationship with God that's played out in history.
Okay. And then they start talking about this hierarchy of being and this idea of a divine order.
Yeah. The king's not too happy when the sage says that Israel is like the choicest of humanity.
Right. It sounds kind of exclusive, doesn't it?
Yeah, but the sage, he uses the king's own skepticism to make a point. He says, okay, you don't believe just anyone can have divine contact, right? So there's got to be something special, something higher.
Right.
And he talks about this hierarchy. You've got plants, animals, humans with intellect. And the king's like, well, the top of that must be the philosophers, right? The smart guys.
But the sage is like, not quite.
Yeah, he describes this hypothetical person, someone who can survive anything, who has total self-control, who knows secrets, hidden things. And the king's like, that sounds divine. That's on a different level.
Yeah.
And the sage is like, exactly, that's the prophet. The one who can see God's connection with Israel, who can communicate that to everyone.
So prophets are human, but they're also connected to this divine order.
Yeah. They bridge the gap, you know, between God, angels, and us. And Israel, because of the prophets, they're part of this divine order too.
It's like they're on a different level of existence.
Yeah. And this term, al-ilahi, the divine order, it's got a lot packed into it.
Yeah, we talked about that before.
It's about how things are arranged, you know? Angels, prophets, really holy people. It's about prophecy itself, the gift of prophecy. And it's about God's commands, the law, and the authority behind it. It's all connected.
So how do you become a prophet? What are the qualifications?
Well, Halevi borrows a bit from the philosopher here, but he tweaks it.
Okay.
He says you need three things: lineage, environment, and education.
Lineage, so like your family.
Yeah. It's like you inherit this special ability, this divine faculty that goes beyond just being smart. And it connects you to God, lets you know things. And this lineage goes all the way back to Adam through specific people to all of Jacob's descendants.
So it's not just about like being born into the right family.
It's not clear,
Yeah.
you know? It could be biological, but it could also be about like psychological and cultural influences too. It's often associated with this idea of the eye of prophecy, like an inner way of seeing.
Interesting. And environment, what about that?
So Halevi says it has to be the land of Israel, that specific place.
Okay.
He says it's got the perfect climate, it's in the center of the world, and it's like the axis mundi, you know, the center point. The best place for prophecy, the best place to live according to the law.
So location matters.
Big time. And then education. For Halevi, this means following the commandments, both the written ones and the oral tradition.
So it's about studying and practicing the law.
Yeah. He says it's like training your soul, you know? It makes you more like an angel, and that's how you become open to revelation.
And this is kind of a dig at philosophy, isn't it?
Right.
Because philosophy is all about these big general ideas, but doesn't really tell you how to live, what to actually do.
Exactly.
So the king, he keeps coming back to creation, right? This whole 6 days thing. It's really bugging him.
Oh, yeah. He's stuck on that.
And he's heard the philosopher talk about the eternal universe. So what does the sage say?
Well, first he dismisses all those other stories, you know, like the Indian records and stuff. He's like, those aren't reliable. They don't have a traditional lineage like we do.
So he's saying the Jewish tradition is special because it's divinely guided.
Yeah, that's his argument. And then about the eternal universe, he says the Greeks, they didn't have this divine order.
So they were just guessing.
Kind of, yeah. He's saying they were smart, but they didn't have that connection, that revelation to guide them. And he even says their climate up north, it might have messed up their records, made it hard to keep track of things.
So he's saying that geography plays a role in knowledge.
Yeah, he thinks the descendants of Shem in their part of the world, they had an advantage. And he's basically saying that Aristotle's view, it wasn't this universal truth, right? It was just his opinion influenced by his culture. Yeah, he even says that if Aristotle had been part of a nation with a real tradition, like Israel, he might have said creation is possible, because the Torah doesn't contradict what we see and experience in the world.
So he's not saying Aristotle was wrong, just that his perspective was limited.
Right. And he goes further. He says, even if matter itself was eternal, the story of this world, how it started, how humans came to be, that's still important.
So even if the universe has always existed, the story of creation still matters.
Yeah. For someone who follows the law, that story's still true.
The king then wants to know how Judaism started. He's thinking maybe it evolved over time, right?
Yeah, like a natural process. But the sage is like, no, no, no. Anomos, a law from God. It's like creation. It happens suddenly, all at once.
Okay.
And then he tells the story of the Exodus.
Yeah, how God freed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt.
Yeah, and how they went to Sinai and all that.
And the king, listening to this story, he's starting to get it.
Yeah.
He's like, okay, there's this divine order at work here. This isn't just some made-up story. This is real.
And the theophany at Sinai, that's the climax, right?
Yeah, God revealing himself to the people.
And the sage says it was meant to prove that God could communicate with humans even though he's not physical.
Which is a tricky thing, right?
Yeah. I mean, how can something that's not physical talk?
Right. So what did they see at Sinai?
The sage describes all these intense sensory experiences. Lightning, thunder, earthquakes, fire, Moses going up and down the mountain into the fire, and then the 10 Commandments on tablets of stone.
But he doesn't say they heard God's voice directly, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. He focuses on the physical stuff.
But even so, the people, they knew those commandments were from God, right?
Yeah. They weren't from Moses or anyone else. They understood that Moses was receiving God's words, even if we don't know exactly how they heard it.
So it's a bit of a mystery.
Yeah. But the point is, no one thought Moses made it up. They saw it as divine writing, and they heard it as divine speech.
Even if we don't know exactly what that means.
Right. And that convinced them that God was real, that he could communicate with them,
Right.
and they all accepted the law.
And the king, he has two reactions to this.
Yeah. First, he's like, someone might think you guys believe God has a body,
Because of all the physical descriptions, right?
Exactly. And second, he says, well, you're excused for not being totally rational because you saw this crazy stuff, right?
Like the experience trumps reason?
Yeah. But he might be missing some of the nuances,
Right, he's assuming it's just blind faith.
Yeah. But the sage, he clarifies. He swears by God that he would never accept anything that's illogical.
So reason still matters.
Big time.
Yeah.
He's defending reason within the context of faith, within the law. And he points to the first 2 commandments, which forbid any physical representation of God.
Right, no idols.
Exactly. And then he makes this logical argument. He says, look, the soul, it's not physical, right? And God created the soul.
So if God can create something non-physical, he must be non-physical too.
Yeah, that's the argument. He's using a Platonic idea of the soul here.
So Halevi's not against reason. He's just saying it has its limits.
Right. And the sage concludes by saying, don't reject the story of Sinai, even if we don't understand all the details. Just accept that it happened.
Because to reject the story is to reject the law, the whole tradition.
Yeah. It's like rejecting the foundation of everything. And then the sage gets really interesting.
Oh.
He says that the theophany might have been even more profound than we can imagine.
So even the tradition, even the story, might not be the whole picture.
Right. It's like there's this mystery, something we can't grasp.
Yeah, and then he talks about imagination.
Yeah, it's weird, right? Because earlier he was saying imagination's not reliable when it comes to prophecy.
So what's going on there?
It's hard to say, but it makes you think maybe there's this inner eye, this way of seeing that's beyond just the physical senses.
Yeah. And maybe that's how the people at Sinai understood what was happening.
Maybe, but the main point is they believed God was behind it, like he was behind creation itself.
So faith in the law is connected to faith in God as the creator.
Exactly. It all ties together.
So we've covered a lot here. Faith, reason, tradition, experience. It's all in Halevi.
Yeah. He's dealing with these big questions that are still relevant, you know?
Absolutely.
Mm.
And his approach, using this historical dialogue, it's really unique. He's defending Judaism, not just with philosophy, but this idea of lived experience, of a divine order that's active in the world.
Yeah, it's a powerful argument.
It really makes you think about what we can know, how
Yeah.
we know it,
Right.
and it shows the limits of both philosophy and faith.
And maybe it shows how they can work together too, you know?
Yeah. So for all you philosophers out there, here's something to think about. Halevi's saying that collective experience, this divinely ordained way of life, it matters. It's part of the equation.
Yeah. It's a different way of looking at truth and ethics.
So how does that fit with your philosophical ideas?